Good evening and welcome to episode 5 of my webcast, False Rise. My name is James Brown, and tonight we have a very interesting topic and guest. Tonight's topic is navigating the criminal justice system. And my guest is the amazing Kara Buford, former defense attorney and prosecutor. Good evening, Kara.
Hi, James. How are you?
Good, good. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for coming. Now, it's not often that you get someone that's both a prosecutor and a criminal defense attorney. That's just amazing that you were able to accomplish both. Uh, how did you get into that? How did you get into the legal system and become both a prosecutor and a criminal defense attorney?
Really good question, James. So interestingly enough, when I was in law school, one of my professors said that if you ever want to be a good attorney, for example, in, I don't know, a prosecutor, criminal prosecutor, she said, you want to be able to be a better adversary. So in this instance, because I had interest in prosecution, I thought, why not be a criminal defense attorney first to become familiar with, I think, just the interaction with defendants, the needs, but most importantly, the lives that I potentially would affect, because as a prosecutor, oftentimes your judgment has a life-changing effect on the accused, the defendant. So just wanting to be a well-rounded attorney, I decided to pursue a career as a defense attorney first, and then luckily I was hired as a prosecutor in the state of New Jersey.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's awesome. Now, being both a prosecutor and a defense attorney, I know that you've had some interesting experiences. Now, from what you said earlier, you were a defense attorney first?
Correct.
Now, what was that like?
Being a defense attorney is interesting. Oftentimes, I mean, listen, I don't know if you listen to rap music or perhaps growing up, you listen to, I would say, hardcore rap music and you're hearing certain lyrics with drugs and guns. I mean, this is real. So oftentimes when I see, suburban kids mimic, people who are who are involved in criminality, I'm like, do you really understand what you're talking about? In particular, I remember when I was representing the interest of a man who had been, so the man actually hired our firm while he was on parole because he received a parole violation, but he was on parole for murder. And I would never forget the time when I was, and I smiled not in jest, but I smiled because this was so serious, right? He was on parole for murder, and James, he and I had to go somewhere together. I don't recall if it was to visit an investigator, don't remember. But the area in which he grew up in, as we were walking down the street, perhaps maybe anywhere between the time of noon to, 2 p.m., as he and I were walking down the street on the sidewalk, there would be men who were around his age and same ethnicity just step aside. They stepped aside and they were kind of still so he could walk by.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, it was, when we talk about, the effects of criminality, and I think sometimes we don't realize that there really are people who are in this lifestyle.
Yes.
And there are some people who choose this lifestyle, but then there are other people who didn't choose this lifestyle. And I had clients who sold drugs, and they sold drugs because this was the only way that they knew of at the time to provide for themselves. Not right or wrong. I don't have a heaven or hell to put anyone in, right?
Sure.
My job is to represent their interests to the best of my ability. So prior to law school, I just thought I was going to be this wonderful corporate attorney. And my experience with the criminal justice system was life-changing. I find myself advocating not just so much for proactive, I find myself advocating for proactive things versus, just sitting back and like, oh, well, we have to let people take care of themselves. No. We have to do things so that we can show others in certain circumstances, living in certain communities, that this isn't your only option.
Oh, wow. Wow. We actually need more of that. We really do. that's part of the reason why I had you on here today, because certain people are going to have questions pertaining to that. They may be entangled in the criminal justice system, or they may know someone that's entangled in the criminal justice system. So hopefully we should be able to give them some answers to that.
I agree.
Now, once you finished your time as a defense attorney, you then switched over to become a prosecutor. Are there any interesting moments or stories or times from the time that you were a prosecutor, state prosecutor?
My most favorite moments
Okay.
were interacting with victims and witnesses and working together to advocate justice, seek justice, not retribution, not an eye for an eye, but to see what was done. There were many of times when, let's say, for instance, a person called the police, maybe a store owner, and, they said, I called the police because I had to make it known that my store shouldn't be burglarized, right? You shouldn't steal from my store, but I don't
Sure.
want to see you talking about the accused. I don't want to see this individual in jail. It's not worth it. So getting the victim or the witnesses, and I'm going to define the difference in a moment, prior to prosecuting a matter or coming to it in disposition, right, is important. So the victim is a person who has been affected by this crime. So a store owner is a victim, right? When you think about prices going up over time, oftentimes stores, especially bigger department stores, what they'll do is they'll increase the cost of products over maybe a course of a year or two to make up for the lost sales because of theft. But if you're talking about that local store, that bodega, that has been affected by criminality, sometimes they're just saying, listen, I just want individuals to know, if you come and you steal from my store, I'm going to call the cops. But then oftentimes they're like, man, listen, how long were they in jail until, prior to bail reform? How long did they sit? So
Yes.
and when I say sit in county jail, right? I think that
Yes.
was justice enough. So oftentimes they would speak up and say, listen, I don't want to move forward. Not necessarily saying that the state will often say, oh, the victim witness, they don't want to move forward, let's throw it out. But we took it into account.
Oh, wow. Now, being a prosecutor, you're normally coming in contact with people after they've had a run-in with the police. But people often have questions about what to do if they do come in contact with the police. So is it all right if I ask you a couple of questions regarding interactions with the police department?
Please.
Oh, thank you. Well, the first question is, and this is the main one, what do you do if you're stopped? A lot of people, especially if you've never been pulled over or stopped, you don't know what to do. Some are nervous, some have seen videos online. They don't know exactly what to do. So what's the first thing that you would recommend that someone do if they're stopped by the police?
Absolutely. So when you see those siren lights, right, red, white, and blue in your rear view mirror,
Sure.
first thing first, look around to see what is the safest or where is the safest area to pull over. Use your signal. You want to be calm. I know it's easier said than done.
Sure.
Signal, pull over, stop the car. You want to put the car in park. Also,
Sure.
I would take my foot off the brake so that the brake light isn't showing. I would turn off also the headlights if you had the headlights on, if it's evening or if it's raining. Then now listen, this is really important. Your movement matters. So typically if it's a police officer who's by himself, oftentimes officers come out in two, so that there may be a police officer kind of walking alongside of the passenger side while another police officer is walking alongside the driver's side or your side. And again, you always want to keep your hands visible. Your movement should be minimal. Now, I know that some legal minds say that you want to have the window already down halfway. I only say if you can safely put that mirror down, press that button, or if you have that manual window maneuver thing, right, that wind the window down, right? So ultimately, you want to just be mindful that you don't want to, because think about it like this. If I go, right, because I think right now all you can see is just, for the most part, my collarbones and up, right? So if you see me moving my arm like this, you don't necessarily know what I'm doing. That's ultimately sometimes the little visuals that police officers get. You're nervous, they're nervous too. So I would minimize movement. If you can keep your hand at the 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock positions of the steering wheel, when the officer comes over, clearly you can say, I'm opening the window, slowly open your window. And then from there, I would say, that's when, or I guess your attention has to be alert to what the officer is asking you, right?
Sure.
And you want to respond in accordance with what he or she is asking. So for example, the officer is going to say, do you know why I pulled you over today? And even if you do know, think about it like this. You don't know why he pulled you over. You may believe you know why he pulled you over, but you don't really know the answer. So you don't want to give more information, because perhaps maybe you're like, oh yeah, you pulled me over because my license is suspended, and the officer in fact pulled you over because you have a busted tail light, right? Or your tail light is out. So you just want to be very mindful. Now, again, the officer will at some point find out that your license is suspended. So a better example would be is you said, oh, officer, you pulled me over because I ran the red light. And the officer is like, I didn't see you run that red light. You actually had the ombre color. So you just want to be mindful. Also, once you provide your credentials, your license, insurance, registration, you then want to hand it over to the officer. The officer is going to run your credentials and then come back. And typically at that point, the officer should express to you why he or she pulled you over. If he hasn't at that point, then that's when you can say, Mr. Officer, Miss Officer, why did you pull me over? And then proceed from there. Again, just remain calm. Sometimes, especially if an officer has a feeling that a person is really nervous, or maybe just young or inexperienced with police civilian interaction, sometimes that officer may try to take advantage of that situation. And then they may say things like, oh, can I search your car? And then you always have the right to say no. An officer shouldn't just search your car because you had a broken headlight. No, an officer needs probable cause to search your vehicle. That means that it's that he has articulated facts that a crime has been committed or is being committed in real time.
Now, we often see videos, online where you see individuals that are pulled over or stopped by the police, and you often hear them saying, I know my rights. You can't do this to me. You can't do this for me. And often in those videos, the officer either walks away or there's some type of confrontation. If you're in a situation where you're stopped by an officer and you feel that your rights are being violated, what should you do?
Safety analysis first. Are you safe? So if an officer pulls you over, sticking with that example, if an officer pulls you over and let's just say, for instance, the officer just doesn't like you for whatever reason, and the officer is just really upset.
Yes.
Maybe the officer asks, hey, can I search the vehicle? And you say, no, you cannot search the vehicle. And then the officer demands for you to get out the car. At that point, safety analysis. Do you want to argue with this officer, this person who has a gun, along their waistline? Do you want to argue with someone who has a taser? Do you want to argue with someone who ultimately your life, right, is in his or her hands? So what a person should do is assess the situation, comply if possible, and then, this is my favorite phrase, documentation beats argumentation. After that interaction has ended, then I would, decide whether or not I want to pursue some type of, if I want to just outright report this incident to, let's say, the Internal Affairs Department for the county by which the officer is employed. Do I want to file suit? Do I want to reach out to the FBI in regards to a violation of a color of law? There's so many different things that you can do in this instance, but the first thing is just make certain that you are safe and that you try to de-escalate the situation. And I'm gonna say this, James, right? And this is a person, an attorney speaking, a woman of color speaking, right?
Yes.
In regards to what I'm gonna say next. It's a shame that a layperson, a civilian, has to be so calm under those under set circumstances, right? And an officer sometimes, and they have this training, they have, you know, the weapons with them, and they can be excessively aggressive. I wish the world were better, but these are the times in which we live in, and everyone's goal should be to go home. So if you have the ability to de-escalate, if you have the ability to try to comply, and oftentimes it doesn't always work, but
Sure.
you as the individual have to basically decide, am I going to be combative verbally tonight, or am I going to try to go home and then try to document everything so that I have an argument later?
To kind of spin off of that question, what if the officer uses excessive force with you? When I say excessive force, meaning the officer uses mechanical force against you, they hit you, they lay their hands on you, do you defend yourself, or do you still just comply?
So if an officer, if they hit you, right? So,
Yes.
so you said if they hit you,
Yes. Whether it be hitting you with a PR-44, which is their nightstick, if they lay their hands on you in an aggressive manner, should you just comply, or do you fight back? What exactly should you do? Because we often see videos of that as well.
James, that is such an important, serious, dangerous question. I mean, think about it like this. We're going to take our time and really walk through this scenario.
Sure.
If an officer hits you,
yes,
you hit that officer back,
mm-hmm.
right? That officer, not that he is legally entitled to do so, but that officer has a decision to use the taser, to use a gun to subdue you, right? And ultimately the officer, as we're seeing play through, you know, the media and the criminal justice system, the officers are then prosecuted, right, for their action. So it's like, I mean, I would comply. I mean, it's at that point, what can you possibly do? Because think about it like this: if an officer is fighting, you know, a civilian, you know, and another officer comes, you know, just so happens to be patrolling the area, and they see a civilian and an officer, you know, in a tussle, do you think that additional police officer is going to come over calmly and say, hey, what's going on? You know, is there no? So again, I say this with much deference. It's as though, I'm gonna say this, in that limited time, the police officer has the authority to dictate what happens next. I would comply because they have weapons, they have a gun, you know, they have ultimately potential backup that can come on the scene at any time and escalate the matter even more. So I would try to comply. But I'm going to say this as my disclaimer: complying doesn't always help the situation. I wish that it would, but unfortunately, we just have to comply, and then, you know, God willing, we live, right? And then document what happens, and then pursue other courses of action thereafter.
That one actually hit home with me. I specifically asked that question because I was in a situation when I was 14. When I was 14 years old, I was walking to a bus stop near my high school. There was an officer there that you can tell was in a very bad mood. He was yelling at a lot of the children after a fight had broken out, and he looked at me and said, all of you kids get out of here. Me, of course, I'm 14, I'm mouthing off. I said, yeah, all right, whatever, man. He grabs me, slams me against a tree, pulls the gun on me, threatens to put a bullet in my head, and then slams me on the ground. Now, in that situation, of course, I'm young. I was afraid and angry. Luckily, nothing else happened. It didn't escalate any further. I went home, told my dad about it. We went to the police station the next day, and we reported the situation to the desk sergeant. And the desk sergeant didn't really seem to care much. The main question that we were asked was, do you have the officer's name, or do you have the officer's badge number? And in situations like this, the average person, they may not think of the officers, they may not think to look for the officer's name or badge number. If someone is in that situation and they do feel that the officer used excessive force, how should they go about reporting it? Should they go to their local police department? Should they try to escalate it to internal affairs, or should they try another means of reporting it?
So because you said excessive force, so yes. I think that just for a moment, let's just back up. So you,
Sure.
a person can report an officer's actions at all times, but
Sure.
excessive force, that actually, under the circumstances that you name, triggers what is called the color of law, right?
Okay.
Which basically, under the color of law, a person who has government authority or a governmental position should not misuse that position by way of their exercise of power. So a prosecutor, a police officer, in this instance, just remind me again, why did this officer stop you on foot?
Well, there was a fight, teenagers, they were fighting near the area that I was standing, maybe about 50 to 100 yards away.
Mm-hmm.
So this officer ordered everyone to leave the area. I was standing in the area because that area happened to be my bus stop.
Okay.
So when he said, all of you kids get out of here, I mouthed off to him a little bit. I just said, yeah, right, whatever. And at that point, he grabbed me, slammed me against a tree, and pulled his weapon on me.
Okay. So at that point, so would you say that at that point, you and the officer saw you around those individuals?
Well, I was about 100 yards away
Okay.
from the actual fight.
Okay, so clearly we're missing a whole bunch of facts to properly assess the situation. However, to your very specific question, what should you do? So when an officer inappropriately uses his or her authority, you can ultimately file a complaint with, or you can reach out to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, or to the United States Attorney General's office to just report this incident, to say that you would like this matter investigated because this officer has used their authority outside of their statutorily, outside of the statutory provision. So an officer is supposed to protect you, right? An officer is supposed to be honest, but in instances where evidence can show that an officer has abused their level of authority and they do certain things such as use excessive force, they sexually assault someone, they intentionally fabricate evidence by way of which causes an individual to lose their liberty rights. And I think there's maybe some other triggering things, right? When officers or people with government positions, when they abuse their authority, what then happens is they have essentially violated the Constitution, and potentially, they run the risk of a criminal trial or ultimately a civil trial. A criminal trial, they can clearly face criminal charges, or a civil trial, ultimately the government may seek some type of injunctive relief for this individual. That particular department may need some training. So it's very fact specific, but what has to be known from this situation is that an officer can be held responsible for using excessive force.
Wow, okay. I heard you mention the FBI. What about going to internal affairs? Should that be your first step in that situation?
Okay, so in regards to the FBI, so the FBI investigates federal crimes. So
Sure.
if you think what the officer did rose to the level of criminality, that's when you go to the FBI. But internal affairs is if you just say, for instance, this officer is picking on you, this officer, is they have done something that, is offensive, but when they haven't used excessive force, when they haven't, sexually assaulted you, then you could perhaps maybe go to them. Maybe you feel that, they're targeting you for whatever reason, that, that they're ignoring your concerns. Then I would go to the internal affairs. And I wouldn't even just reach out to the local municipality where the officer works, because, well, let's back up. So in the state, typically you have the local level municipality officers, but then you have in the state of New Jersey, at least, you have sheriff officers who work for counties. Sure. So you have to decide if you want to go to the local level municipality. Well, first and foremost, you want to assess where the officer is from. If it's a local level municipal officer, then you would decide if you want to go to that particular municipality precinct, or if you want to go to the sheriff's office. I would always advise going to the sheriff's office and then seeking, what proper course I should take to properly document what this police officer did to me.
Oh, wow. That's new information. I actually didn't know any of that. I genuinely didn't. I was actually under the impression that if you have an altercation with the police that you believe may be a bit excessive, I was always under the interpretation that you try to file try to file a report with the local police department, and then you file a report with Internal Affairs. That's interesting.
Listen, so here's what, and notice what I said. I would go to the not superior court, the superior county or the county office of that particular jurisdiction, right, to find out the proper protocol. Because I myself, prior to law school, had a complaint with the officer, and I physically went to that precinct and I handed in a written letter and I gave it to an out officer, being inexperienced, not knowing, never heard back. But it wasn't until years later that there's level of accountability. So sometimes, just filing a report, okay, sometimes a person, and this is really important, you may think you're filing a report by speaking to a police officer. You don't know that, because oftentimes you don't sign anything. So the key, and I'm so happy that you pointed this out. The key here is reaching out to, I would say, the governing entity or the supervising entity of where that police officer is employed to make certain that you have identified what steps need to be taken so that you can properly document the incident. That is key.
Oh, wow. Wow. I knew that I was going to learn something from this episode.
That's funny.
All right. Another question that I have, and this is a situation that I've seen in person. I've seen individuals that have been stopped by the police, and from my purview, it doesn't appear that the person had committed a crime, but the person has an interaction with the police, and the officer arrests them, and they tell them that you're being a disorderly person.
Okay.
To me, it appears as if the person hadn't committed any crime, but can you explain exactly what a disorderly person is?
So a disorderly person's offense is a misdemeanor. So based upon which state the person is in, it's either going to be called misdemeanor. In Michigan, it's called misdemeanor. And in New Jersey, it's going to be called a disorderly person's offense. So it essentially is a crime that typically, should a person be convicted or plead guilty, typically they're going to spend less than a year in county jail.
So
it's a less serious offense.
Okay. Now, I know that sometimes when people, when they're charged with disorderly persons, when an officer tells them that they're being a bit disorderly, you get situations where the person tends to be angry, and the comment that they often make is, I didn't do anything, and the officer may try to put them in cuffs. At that point, they may feel that the officer may say, well, you're resisting arrest. At that point, do other charges come along with that if you're charged with resisting arrest, or more serious charges come with it if you're charged with resisting arrest?
So you're asking me, can a person only be charged with resisting arrest?
Yes.
It really depends, and here's why. So before a person resists arrest, something had to have happened. And oftentimes, that's a really good question, but it's fact specific because, for example, an officer in his report may say, I observed John Doe urinating, which typically is a misdemeanor, lewd conduct. And when I tried to tell him to stop and cite him, he then, became irate, he became aggressive. And as a result, I told him to calm down. I gave him 2 warnings to calm down. He refused, and I decided that I was going to arrest him. And then let's say, for instance, John Doe then becomes aggressive and then starts kind of moving his hand so that the officers can't put him in handcuffs. So in the actual police report, the officer can say these were the underlying facts, but they can ultimately decide only to, charge him for the resisting arrest. So it's important to look at what the police report says and what was the final decision. But typically, and I'm not a believer in overcharging. When I say overcharging, basically trying to write or give a ticket or a citation for every little thing. But typically, an officer shouldn't just cite someone for resisting arrest. But I guess it also really depends on the municipality or the actual state, the jurisdiction. I haven't seen it, but it's like I said, if the officer documents it in the police report and the supplemental, I mean, I haven't come into an experience where the law says no, you cannot. But again, it's a law specific, state specific question.
Got it. All right. Well, here's another one for you. It's a bit of a doozy. Some of the questions that I asked are based on things that we're seeing on the internet, especially in light of everything that's going on. We often see videos of people's interactions with the police, often with no context. So we'll see situations, or you may see a video online where an officer may stop someone or even come to their home, and the officer may want to search the person or their vehicle. In those cases, I know that it's often said that you need a warrant. Is that correct?
Most times. So let's back up. The accused will say you need a warrant.
Yes.
So yeah.
Now, who would determine if a warrant is needed?
Well, so the circumstances. So if an officer has belief that a crime is being committed or is in fact witnessing that crime. So say, for instance, if an officer sees a woman, let's say, for instance, the officer is patrolling down the street and then he sees a car pulls up, a gentleman, the driver gets out of the car, goes into the back seat, and then sees, let's say, for instance, a grown adult just kicking and screaming, looking as though that, you know, they're fighting for their life. And then the gentleman brings the individual, the woman, into the home. If that officer witnesses that, it looks like a kidnapping, right? You know, you have an individual taking someone against their will, right? A possible kidnapping, I should say, right?
Sure.
So that officer does have, there's a crime, and they call it like an exigent circumstance. So there are certain exceptions to a actual search warrant. So you want to look at what's happening, right? You want the officer has to decide whether or not it's an immediate threat. When I say threat, the event taking place isn't immediate. Now, for example, if an officer believes that a person has, 6 or 7, duffel bags of cocaine, that's not immediate unless they have, more information. They're going to have to go to the judge, whichever judge is signing warrants, and have to provide an affidavit which spells out what their proofs are, what the probable cause is, and the judge has to decide whether or not a warrant is valid. So let's go back up. Where a search warrant comes into effect, the Fourth Amendment provides individuals, you and I, with a reasonable expectation of privacy. And, we have higher levels of expectation of privacy based upon where you are. You have probably the highest level of expectation of privacy in your home. You have somewhat of an expectation of privacy in your car. So when law enforcement or extensions of law enforcement want to invade your home or the areas where you have this reasonable expectation of privacy, they're going to need a warrant, unless an officer can verbally say that, okay, they hear guns, it's a shootout, like they hear shooting coming from an area. Okay,
now if, let's just say they get to your vehicle and they look at your vehicle and they see what appears to be some type of powder. They see a powder inside of your vehicle. They look inside and they ask you to open your trunk or your glove compartment. Are you required to comply with that request? Or would they need a search warrant in order to get into your glove compartment or trunk because it's locked?
Really good question. That's a state-specific question. So again, so there's a United States Constitution, right? The state constitution, but then there are court cases which interpret the Supreme Court interprets the United States Constitution, but the state individual constitution is interpreted by the court in that particular state. Now, why is this important? It depends on what state you live in. So, but typically, in most jurisdictions, if an officer has belief that, let's say, for instance, it was a normal traffic stop. It was a normal traffic stop, and the officer, as he has approached the vehicle, I don't know, let's use marijuana. He, he smells marijuana, and then he sees what looks like marijuana paper on a dashboard, in some visible place. Then the officer, because, I'm assuming, well, we assume that the officer, by way of the academy and training, has, come in contact with marijuana before, is familiar with the smell, and then, in light of the smell, and then seeing the paper to wrap the marijuana in, he at that point can then search the vehicle. He can ask the individuals to step out of the car and search the areas of the vehicle where it's reasonable to believe that other evidence of the marijuana, crime would be, such as maybe in, the cup holder or the glove compartment. But oftentimes the answer to your question is state specific because it's based upon what the court says.
Oh, wow. Wow. Okay. So if you are in a situation like this, you are stopped by the police stop your vehicle. Search your vehicle. Should you contact the lawyer immediately?
Oftentimes when your freedom is going to be limited, right?
Yes.
So again, I wouldn't want to make up as much as I would not want to move, right? Especially if you have to reach into pockets, reach into purses. But there will come a time, should a person be arrested, that they can, but they will be offered a phone call. And with that call, you can call your attorney, or let's say, for instance, if the police, has you aside and, they haven't ultimately placed you under arrest and you have your freedom, but it doesn't look as though the police are intimidated by your presence. Actually, no, I'm not even gonna say that. I was gonna say, if you're off to the side, you can pull out your cell phone, but no, because it's just too dangerous. Oftentimes when you pull over, the police have you sitting down at the sidewalk, and typically there's an officer standing in front of you, so you really have to be very specific. But should you be arrested, you will be offered a phone call.
And I guess that should be one of your first phone call. You believe that you should contact an attorney so that you know your rights?
Listen, it's not about, so when you are arrested, you are going to be Mirandized, which is you have the right to remain silent. Anything that you say against you can be used against you in a court of law. You have a right to an attorney, and should you not be able to afford one, one shall be appointed to you, right? So typically officers have to say something to that effect, right, of the Miranda rights. You have to advise individuals of what they are entitled to by way of law. Now, the question is, I don't know about you, James, I don't know any attorney's numbers by heart. So it's like sometimes you like let's be, I don't.
Yes.
So, and your phone oftentimes is taken. So yes, if you, and there's, to my knowledge, there probably is I don't know, some 1-800 number, 1-800 get me an attorney, right? But sometimes it's just not that easy. So you definitely want to have, but I think that this is a serious conversation or a serious question. Should you be in an area where you're constantly pulled over, or you've had past experiences with law enforcement that yielded in an arrest? You want to have one particular person who is competent and can research an attorney, so that ultimately your rights are represented. But nowadays, unless the crime is really egregious, at least in the state of New Jersey, the court, with bail reform, there really isn't monetary bail. And I would say, I forgot the actual time frame, but I think within I think 2 to 3 business days after a person has been, not even business days, 2 to 3 days after a person is arrested, they have to appear before the court, and the court will determine whether or not, based upon what is called, it's a objective test. It's an objective system, which ultimately the court will take into consideration factors of the offense that you committed, your background. They'll input that information into what's called the PSA, and the PSA will give a number, right? And based upon the number, will determine 2 things. How likely are you to return to court, and how likely are you to be a threat to society? Because when it comes to bail, right, typically when a person wants to speak to an attorney right away, they want to make sure that they're not going to be in jail until the disposition of this crime. So in New Jersey, with the new bail reform, ultimately the system, or the judicial system, tries to help the accused individual get out of jail as quickly as they can. And based upon that PSA number that I just mentioned, depending upon the factors, a person may be released on their own recognizance, meaning that the court just trusts you, come back, or they may be placed on a GPS monitoring system, or one of those bracelets, or based upon how dangerous the crime is or their failure to comply with court's orders in the past to return to court, they may just have to stay incarcerated. So I don't want, sometimes people get real into, I don't know who to call, but at least in the state of New Jersey, there are mechanisms in place for an individual to make certain that, that individual is in fact being processed and is not sitting in jail, right? The way that they used to years ago, waiting for the disposition of the case.
I should get my notebook. I need to start writing all these things down. Oh, wow. That's wow. Again, as with almost every question that I'm asking, I'm getting new information that I didn't have, as well as a lot of other people. A lot of people, they may not be aware of these things. You get nervous. Of course, if you're in an interaction with a police officer, you're usually nervous anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you're handcuffed, your nerves kick in. And if you're taken to the police station, again, your nerves kick in. So you may not know these things, or you may be too nervous or emotionally upset to think of these things. So I really appreciate you answering these questions.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's my pleasure. Now,
we've seen situations where, especially with you being a former prosecutor and defense attorney, well, first of all, can you explain what a plea deal is?
Absolutely. So a plea deal is the prosecutor's offer. Is not required by law. It's fully at the prosecutor's discretion if they want to give an offer, or kind of in a sense, I don't want to call it an award, but
sure.
The prosecutor has evaluated the case and looked at the defendant's criminal history and decided whether or not, in an effort to resolve this matter in a cost-effective and time-effective manner, right? Because again, the prosecutor works for the state, so it's taxpayer funds, and then also time before a judge, which is additional, taxpayer funds. So by way of the plea deal, the prosecutor has a way of not incentivizing, but ultimately acknowledging what the pros and the cons of this individual accepting a plea, acknowledging what they did. In exchange, the prosecutor will typically give somewhat of a more lenient recommendation to jail or prison than by way of the person being convicted of the underlying offense, and then the judge sentencing them to more time. So I think what's really important, I just want to expound upon this for a moment. A plea deal, or plea offer, I should say, is by way of the prosecutor's discretion. It is not something that an individual is entitled to. That's A. And B, I mean, when you think about it, right, we all are individuals. We make mistakes. So if a person has decided to acknowledge their wrongs and they want to say, you know what, I want to plead guilty to this in exchange for you giving a recommendation to a lower sentence, that's important, because here's the thing. Prosecutors do not sentence, judges sentence. So even when, and I don't really recall a prosecutor, or a judge rejecting my plea, because keep in mind, the plea deal is between the prosecutor and the defense attorney. But by way of the judge's discretion, the judge has the ability to say, I don't accept this plea deal. You see that often happen in municipal court, where if a person has been charged with, I don't know, careless driving 3 or 4 times, and the prosecutor, by way of wanting to, resolve this matter, may offer some, I don't know, just some plea to something that more or less is just fines. Now, careless driving is going to be fines, but then it's going to be points. But then the municipal judge can say to the municipal prosecutor, I'm not going to accept this plea because look at this person's record. So in a criminal, on a superior level, you also can come into contact with the judge who's going to say, listen, no, this individual has been before me 15 times, 9 of which when he was a juvenile. And now he's here before me again for the same offense. And sometimes judges are just going to say, no, I don't care, try the case. And literally, sometimes you have instances where a judge will tell the prosecutor, look, if you don't want, if you don't feel comfortable, giving, a higher recommendation to, I don't know if it's a low level, let's say for instance, indictable offense, a felony, a third or fourth degree. With a third or a fourth degree, there isn't a presumption of incarceration, right? So let's back
Okay.
up. When they plead guilty to a third or fourth offense, or when they plead guilty to a crime which is that has a degree of third or fourth, right, degree,
Yes.
which is the level of severity, typically there is an assumption of no incarceration. However, if this person has a criminal history, that's going to increase their chances of custodial incarceration versus, probation, non-custodial, post the disposition. So the judge can say, okay, Madam Prosecutor, you mean to tell me this person has been, this person's third or fourth burglary, charge. He was just here, let's say a year before, and now you want to give him probation once again? It's not going to happen. Madam Prosecutor, you're going to try the case. Come up something better. It happens,
Sure,
because also, especially for busier municipalities, sometimes prosecutors are like, listen, I know my municipality, and if this person is only, stealing cars, I'm worried about, the drug dealers with the guns. So it's always fact specific, and it's so much, that goes on that I would say the public at large doesn't get to hear.
Now, we often hear about people that are arrested or have taken plea deals where they may not necessarily have been guilty, where they may have just taken a plea deal because they didn't have the money to fight the case, or they were a bit nervous about the case. And unfortunately, those people at times may serve time in jail. When they get out, they may decide to get their lives together. And in order to get their lives together, in certain cases, you have to get your records expunged for certain crimes. What exactly is the process? I'm sorry, well, what types of crimes can be expunged from your record?
Really good question. Fact specific, and the list is long. So in the state of New Jersey, you would want to go if you just Google I don't know the actual statute code, but pull up the expungement statute in the state of New Jersey, and it lists which crimes are not expungible. So I know some of them, which are rape, aggravated sexual assault, kidnapping, treason, your serious offenses. So typically what you can expunge are, in regards to felonies, you can expunge shoplifting, typically drug charges, sometimes burglary. But here's the thing. In order to expunge in the state of New Jersey a felony, you had, at the time of expungement, had to have zero other crimes or other convictions of felony. So if you have a clear record prior to this one incident, then you are eligible to expunge your record. That's for serious felonies. Now for misdemeanors or disorderly persons offenses, I think it's like a number, you have to confirm it's like 5 or more or something like that, or 5 or less, and you can expunge the particular disorderly persons offense, and we call disorderly persons offense that in the state of New Jersey, as opposed to misdemeanors. Now, this is what is important. Based upon the type of crime that you are expunging dictates how long you have to wait. So if a person has, let's say for instance, I don't know that particular list, that exhaustive list, and the waiting period. And here's something that's really important. I think since 2018 it has changed. But let's say for instance, if it's a burglary, maybe the burglary will the waiting period is 2 years. But if it's a drug offense, based upon the degree, perhaps maybe that drug offense, the waiting period for the lesser degree, right, may be, let's say for instance, 2 years, versus the drug offense with the higher degree is 5 years. So again, you want to look at your record prior to, then you also want to look at the underlying offense, the offense at issue, and then you want to make sure that the needed waiting period has taken place. And then also really important is that a person has to be mindful that they should also expunge. And expunge just means to extract from your record. Expunge the charge as well as the arrest. And in the state of New Jersey, we have what's called PTI, which is
Okay.
pretrial intervention. And pretrial
Nice.
intervention is typically for your first indictable, non-serious, or probably like victim offense outside of drugs. And typically, sometimes with PTI, depending on the offense, right, underlying offense, it could be
Yes.
about 6 months that you can wait before. I would say it probably depends on how long you are on probation. So if you're on probation for 6 months, and the waiting period will be 6 months. If it's a
Okay.
year, then the waiting period will be 1 year. And you
Oh
also
wow.
might expunge that arrest. So every person who has been indicted or ultimately has pled guilty or was found guilty by way of a crime, and if they fall under the category of one of those expungable offenses, then they want to make sure that they are expunging the crime and as well as the arrest. And because essentially it's two records that we really have. We have our record for personal use, such as like employment or housing, and then you have your record for law enforcement. Now, with law enforcement and prosecution, it will always show in your record, but it will just maybe show it as expunge or something to that effect. But it's just good to know that when we say expunge, it's really for employment purposes.
Oh wow. Wow. Okay, so that's a good piece of information. So if anyone here has had any interaction with the police, make sure that you get your record expunged and your arrest expunged.
Yes.
That's I'm laughing because there's so much information that isn't out there for the public. There's a lot of information that most people don't know. Now, what happens if someone expunges their record but not the arrest? How does that show up in their paperwork or in their records?
It's just going to show arrest and the date, typically.
Just an arrest?
So it's going to show arrested May 4th, 2019.
But it won't have the actual charge.
It shouldn't, no.
Okay, but that would still cause an issue. You know, if you try to apply for a job or apply for an apartment, they will probably see that. So,
well, not necessarily. So remember, and for any person who is listening who had interactions with the police, look at the questions very specifically. They're like various types of questions. Have you ever been arrested? Have you ever been convicted? Have you ever pled guilty? Sometimes those questions are separated, but if the question says, have you ever been convicted, and that's it, and you were never convicted, pled guilty, typically the two are together, you know, and you were never, like, let's say for instance, the prosecution, the prosecutor decided that, you know what, the state didn't have enough evidence, so they dismissed your charges. You can honestly say no, but if they ask you, had you ever been arrested, even if the prosecutor for the same reasons has decided to dismiss the charges, if the question says, have you ever been arrested, you have been arrested and you have to tell the truth. You should tell the truth.
Wow.
So just look at the question.
Now, speaking of convictions, you actually spoke about that a little bit earlier. If you're convicted for a crime and you believe that you're innocent, you believe that you had poor defense, you had poor legal defense, or there was an issue with the evidence, what's the process for filing an appeal?
So, really good question. You listen to what the judge says during your sentence. So typically, depending on the type of crime, a person will plead guilty, especially if it's a felony in the state of New Jersey, and then there is going to be anywhere between like a 3-week and longer time period of, I would say, before the sentence date actually takes place, or the sentencing, I should say, takes place. And why that happens is because there's an individual group that will interview the defendant. They will look over the plea colloquy, which was said on the record, look at, sometimes other factors to determine how or what the judge should consider when deciding a sentence. So that's really important. So I just wanted to bring that up. But to answer your specific question, during the sentence, or after a person is sentenced, the judge will typically, and if state specific, will say, and also level of crime specific, you have X amount of days to appeal this matter in writing. So again, you want to listen to what the judge says, and if you know for a fact that you want to appeal, I would start the process immediately, especially if a person potentially is going to be or is going to serve custodial time. Sometimes.
Can you actually explain what custodial time is? So,
Oh, absolutely. So when a person has pled guilty or has been found guilty of a crime, if the sentence, right, the consequences of that particular crime results in, let's say, for instance, prison time based upon the fact that it was a felony, that's considered custodial
sure.
sentence. Versus if, let's say, the facts were in the favor of the defendant, even though the prosecution said, Judge, I gave a recommendation that this defendant spend, I don't know, like 1 year in county jail, and the judge is like, no, I think looking at these facts that a non-custodial sentence is appropriate. I issue, X amount of time or probation. So custodial, you physically go to prison or jail based upon your crime, or versus non-custodial, which is probation.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of sentencing, something that's been in the news for years, I guess probably as long as we've both been alive, is mandatory minimum sentencing.
Okay.
We came up at a very interesting time because I think that we were both born during the crack. So during the crack era, you had a lot of mandatory minimum sentencing. So, for example, if you were caught with a certain amount of crack, you were sentenced to a lot more time than someone that was caught with powdered cocaine.
Okay.
So what are your views on mandatory minimum sentencing? And actually, I'm sorry, before we get to your views, I'm sorry. Can you explain what mandatory minimum sentencing is? Because there may be certain viewers out there that aren't familiar with it.
So absolutely. So typically that is mandatory sentencing is dictated by your legislators, right? So the people who write your laws, and it's taken into consideration that for certain crimes, for whatever reason, the state or the legislators believe that in order to show that that this particular behavior isn't tolerated, typically they'll have a statutory requirement time period of incarceration, or a mandatory sentence of X amount of years for the underlying offense. My views on that really, so I see the good school of thought of wanting to be cohesive and making certain that throughout the state of New Jersey, every person who's been charged with, I don't know, possession of or used drugs, every person who has been charged with, I don't know, cocaine, you have, and if it falls beneath, this amount of weight and ultimately is considered, this degree, everyone should be charged in a similar way. But the problem is there's bias, right? By way of the example that you just gave, you have one drug that essentially, one plant, if you will, that creates two different variations of ultimately the same plant, right? So you have crack and then you have cocaine. It's just how you cook it. It's it's just, right? It's just different.
Sure.
But you had, for the longest, individuals being treated severely more harsh by way of their use or even selling of crack versus cocaine. My thoughts, it's hard to say because there are certain crimes that that bothers me, and drugs, right? The sale of drugs, the distribution of drugs. Oftentimes when you're talking about drug distribution, you're also talking about gun usage, right?
Sure.
So the mandatory minimum sentence really should, I think we need to reevaluate the concept and then also reevaluate the application. And, if it's going to be objective, similar to PSA, when in regards to how it's determined with, by way of if a person who has just been charged with offense, if that person should receive, let's say, for instance, a non-custodial release prior to the disposition of the case, it should be the same with, with certain crimes. So if we're going to say that we're going to treat one type of crime the same, let's make sure we do it in objective manner, because it's important. You know, we have to dissuade people from using guns. We have to dissuade people from drinking and driving, but you have to apply it consistently. There has to be some level of accountability when we are, you know, when we are as prosecutors. I'm no longer a prosecutor, but when prosecutors are deciding whether or not they're going to take someone out of, let's say they call it like a stipulated particular offense, because a stipulated offense basically means, statutorily speaking, because this person has been charged with this offense, and because, you know, this person has been charged with this offense, statutorily speaking, they have to serve X amount of time. But then you see that maybe in some jurisdictions throughout the state of New Jersey, they're more lenient with certain persons. So it's about being completely objective. We need it.
Yes,
I'm gonna say we do need it based upon the crime. Drunk driving, we need it. You know,
yes,
like if a person keeps getting behind the wheel, we need it, but the law has to be applied evenly and objectively.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Now, speaking of that, I'm going to ask you about something. That's the last question I'm going to ask you.
Okay.
It's about something that's really, really big in the news. And it may be in your wheelhouse because it does involve the law. Defund the police.
Okay.
That's something that's all over the news. That's something that everywhere that you look, everyone has an opinion on it. What's your opinion on defund the police?
You have to be, when we talk about defund the police, it's not about jumping on the bandwagon, but it's really understanding what defund the police is. Defund the police is taking money from your local, or not even local, but from police funds, budgets, in order to, let's say, for instance, finance non-policing activity. So you can, so basically it's really taking money from police, right?
Okay.
And saying, I'm going to do something else with it because, you know, the police or the police budget, right, is too large. And as a result, because the police budget is so large, other things in the community are not happening, or we don't have monies in other areas because the police budget is so wrong. I always say, all right, look at number one, where you are living. If you are living in a crime infested area, you need the police. People may not say I'm pro law. I am completely for Black Lives Matter. I say Black Lives Matter proudly, right? But I'm also in support of law enforcement, good law enforcement, right? Now, keeping this in mind, to defund the police, we have to think about what does this mean? Are we saying defund the police and we don't want police officers to get raises? It's a dangerous job being law enforcement. It's dangerous. I think during COVID, we saw how many law enforcement officers, contracted the virus, right? By way of interacting with the public. When my ex, who is in law enforcement, said it the best. He said, when something happens in your life, who do you call? 911. Who comes first? The police. So we have oftentimes, even when a person, let's say for instance, has fallen down the stairs, oftentimes, the ambulance, right, EMT cannot go into homes without police officers clearing it. So when you're talking about cutting budgets, we have to be mindful of what we're asking for. Now, what we should ask is, I truly think, accountability of all the funds. If you can take maybe some money if it's warranted, and take it out of the police budget and do something that's beneficial for the community, fine, do it. I'm not for, defunding the police and taking millions of dollars only, to have the officers, make hamburgers for the community at large. It's nice to have that interaction, but you're talking about millions of dollars, which can, change the community. Fine, invest more in the schools. But I'm going to say this, and maybe people may not agree with me. Oftentimes the school boards of education have plenty of money, right? But they're not managing it properly. The way to punish the police is not by saying we're going to defund, take all your money. It's basically saying, okay, well, let's look at the resources that you have. Are we giving you too much money? If, say, for instance, every year, if the police budget has a surplus of, I don't know, $7 million, and the schools are, gravely underfunded, or if the library needs to be rebuilt, then yes. But if the police budget is not going to, a whole bunch of overtime, but perhaps maybe tactical training. Officers need training for, implicit biases. They need training. It's a lot of things that they deal with psychologically. So, but we want to be mindful that when you're talking about defunding the police, it can ultimately hurt your community in the long run if you live in a crime-infested area. We need the police. We have to, I think, you know what, James, the question isn't about defunding the police. The question is, how can we hold law enforcement accountable? How can we ask blue to hold blue accountable? And what I mean by that, in law enforcement, there will always be a racist officer. There will always be somebody who believes that they're above the law. But if we can come to a point where we have, good officers, identify those officers who are, let's say, racist, who use excessive force, then, let's get rid of the bad apples. But to defund the police, no, we need our officers.
Wow. Thank you for that answer. And, thank you for joining me, Kara. Do you have any final thoughts before we sign off?
Thank you, James, for this. And I just hope that you continue just to have more conversations because, listen, I'm sorry. You asked me, do I have anything else to say? And I say no as I continue to talk, right? But conversations like this need to happen because I am a well-rounded woman of color who is an attorney. And I just think we have to have better visuals, better interactions with law enforcement. And I'm going to extend this challenge to, let's say, for instance, a person who's maybe in college and they're undecided on their major. Look into law enforcement. Get into law enforcement. Be the change that we need. It's a great job. It's a respectable job, and I don't think enough people of color are thinking about being law enforcement. You can make a lot of money. I was talking to my godfather, who's a lieutenant, and within 4 years of being in law enforcement, you have the ability to make over 6 figures, right? So imagine and sometimes they will pay you based upon the degree that you have. You have a pension, you have great health care. Get into law enforcement. Be the change that our community needs. It's important that we police ourselves. Police were essentially the institution, right? The purpose of police was ultimately to bully, if you will, to monitor the Black community, to protect white privilege, right? But we need police in 2020 and moving forward. But if we can't get the current officers to change and to treat us like we are somebodies, then we need to become law enforcement.
Yeah, that's great. I do encourage that myself. I, as I've said earlier, have had issues with members of the police department in my past. And because of that, I joined the Citizen Police Academy program at my job just to get a better understanding of law enforcement and the police department. And it helped me to learn a lot about what they do and why they do the things they do. Another benefit of it is that now when I see those officers, they know me on a first name basis. Oh, wow. We can have a conversation with each other. Our interactions are different. I don't see them as an adversary, and they don't necessarily see me as one. So I believe that if our towns have these citizen police academies or the national nights out, I believe that it helps, and I do believe that community outreach from the police department helps. I believe that having having officers that are from your community helps. Yes. The town that I was assaulted by that officer in was a town that I grew up in. Mm-hmm. Whenever I go back and visit that town, I see that most of the officers there were guys that I went to high school with. Wow. So, the policing is better because they're from the neighborhood. They understand the people from the neighborhood. The people feel a lot more comfortable with them. So, I'm hoping that it becomes a model across the nation for us to start working with each other and to start understanding each other.
I agree.
Yes, definitely. But again, Kara, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You've been an amazing, amazing guest. And for all of you that have been watching, I really appreciate you tuning in. If you have any other questions or comments, as usual, please contact me at fall2risepod@gmail.com. And don't forget about our YouTube channel, Fall to Rise Podcast. Thank you. Have a good night.